Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Sports Exchange. This is a special edition of the Sports Exchange, and on the program tonight is Tom Shanahan, and Tom and I will be doing a weekly program that focuses on his website, the ShanahanReport.com. And Tom, how you doing tonight?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure, Tom. Always great to have you on here. So, one of the things that we're going to be doing under this format with you is focusing on on a couple of your top stories on the website when we bring you on. So why don't we go ahead and lead off with your first one?
Well, one of them is I talked to Dan Dierdorf, the Pro Football Hall of Famer, and actually College Football Hall of Famer at Michigan, and then Pro Football Hall of Famer with the St. Louis Cardinals, about Don Coryell. He's been a finalist in the past for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And people mostly know him for his time with the San Diego Chargers, the Air Coryell offense, Dan Fouts, quarterback in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And Dan has pushed Coryell's case hard for earning a berth in the Hall of Fame. And so last year I wrote a story for the website with Dan, all the reasons why the Coryell offense, passing game, is so special. And how it changed the NFL. Just about all the passing you see at the NFL stems from Don Coryell's offense. A lot of times, Sid Gilman, the old AFL coach for the San Diego Chargers, who's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, he threw the ball a lot. And then a lot of times, of course, Bill Walsh was famous for the West Coast offense. And the 49ers won Super Bowl titles. So he gets a lot of credit for being the father of the passing game, or godfather. But if you talk to a lot of people that have played the game, like Dan Fouts, and studied it, they say it all stems from Coryell. But the writers, the media that votes on the Pro Football Hall of Fame, a lot of times if you didn't win a Super Bowl or make a Super Bowl, they kind of discount you. And so that's the battle Dan Fouts has been fighting. And I wrote a story last year with all the reasons Dan believes Coryell belongs in the Hall of Fame. But, he also, before Coryell got to the San Diego Chargers, he did some amazing things with the old St. Louis Cardinals. And Dan Dierdorf was starting his third year when Coryell showed up in 1973, and the Cardinals were always a bad franchise. In fact, they had never been to the playoffs since they'd moved from the Chicago Cardinals to the St. Louis Cardinals. Their last playoff trip was 1948, and so back in those days, the St. Louis Cardinals were in the NFC East, and at the time, of course, the Dallas Cowboys with Roger Staubach. They'd been in the Super Bowl in the 1970 season, lost to the Colts, returned to the Super Bowl in the 71 season and won the Super Bowl. And then the next year, the 72 season, the NFC East was won by the Washington Redskins with George Allen. And so those teams were dominating the NFC East. And the Cardinals were also Rams. Well, Coryell comes in, and without anywhere near the resources of the Cowboys and the Redskins, he wins the 1974 NFC East title, and then repeats again in the 1975. And it was all because of the passing game that was just so far ahead of the run-oriented NFL that defenses didn't know how to contend with it. And this is particularly noteworthy because Dallas Cowboys coach Tom Landry made the Pro Football Hall of Fame, like he should have. But he was known as a defensive wizard, defensive mind. Same with George Allen. He didn't win a Super Bowl like Landry, but he was in a Super Bowl. The 72 season, they lost to the Miami Dolphins. And he was known for his defensive mind. And here comes Coryell from San Diego State, which back then was a pretty small college. It wasn't a Mountain West Conference member like it is now, a mid-major, so to speak. And he comes in with this passing game and just turns the NFL upside down. And ever since then, NFL teams have been feeding off what Coryell brought to the league with the St. Louis Cardinals and the San Diego Chargers. So it's kind of to back up the information that Dan Fouts makes in his case, I thought I'd talk to Dan Dierdorf and get information from him, and he gave me a lot of great stuff.
Well, I will tell you this. I may be one of those few people, Tom, that remembers that St. Louis Cardinals team. Jim Hart played on that team. Dan Dierdorf was definitely an anchor out of the University of Michigan. I recently sent you a photo of myself and Dan over at the Verbo Citrus Bowl, and it was neat because Dan Dierdorf, to me, was one of the most underrated offensive linemen out there, but yet in a lot of people's eyes, but then again, he didn't have social media to build him up. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tom. Wasn't Conrad Dobler on that team as well?
Yes, he was.
Right, that's what I thought. So, again, you're right. He was way ahead of his time, and Jim Hart obviously was a pretty fine quarterback. And they played at Busch Stadium and shared a stadium with the St. Louis Cardinals, the baseball team. So that was a multi-purpose stadium, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So back then it was a modern stadium.
Yeah, right. Yeah, modern cookie cutter, whatever you want to call them, right?
Yeah.
So tell me, what do you remember about those St. Louis Cardinals teams?
Well, first let me back up here a little bit because
Sure.
Coryell has been a finalist for the past 3 or 4 years. He hasn't made the final cut. And Dan Fouts gives the case before the media. And last year, he kind of gave. Last year was his first chance to do it. He kind of gave a formal, even-keeled presentation. Here are the facts. And he's so frustrated that the writers are so stubborn about it. Because if you talk to a lot of the coaches, Don Shula is one of the coaches. He says that Coryell belongs in the Hall of Fame. And this was in my story with Dan. There's no better example of that than, Shula won his Super Bowls with the Miami Dolphins with almost 90% running game. Larry Zonka, Jim Kick, and Mercury Morris. They barely ever passed the ball. I think they won one of their Super Bowls with Bob Greasy only throwing about 7 passes.
Right.
So here comes Coryell in the 70s. He starts changing the league with the Cardinals and the Chargers and throwing the ball. And then Dan Marino's available to the Dolphins in 1984. He falls to the bottom of the draft. And here's Don Shula, the ultimate run defense coach. And having watched Coryell and lost to Coryell's teams, he switched to a wide-open passing game with Dan Marino.
Right.
And they went to the Super Bowl. They didn't win, but they went to it.
Right.
And Shula's on record saying that Coryell belongs in the Hall of Fame for how he changed the league, and that's one of Dan Fouts' points is, if Don Shula thinks he belongs in, John Madden thinks he belongs in. John Madden was Coryell's defensive coordinator at San Diego State before he went on to the Oakland Raiders and won a Super Bowl. And then one of Don's assistants at both San Diego State and with the St. Louis Cardinals, and actually for maybe a couple years with the Chargers, was Joe Gibbs. And then Joe Gibbs goes to the Washington Redskins and wins some Super Bowls. And both Madden and Gibbs say that Coryell belongs in the Hall of Fame. They say that they would not be in the Hall of Fame if it was not for Coryell. And they just always thought Coryell would have made the Hall of Fame by now. But that sticking point with the writers, the media, is he hasn't been in a Super Bowl. But the point I wanted to get to was, so the last 3 or 4 years, Don has been a finalist. He didn't make the cut this year, so he won't be when the Pro Football Hall of Fame voters gather the Saturday before the Super Bowl next week and vote for their, I think, 5, 6 players that they pick. Coryell won't be up for a vote because kind of unusual circumstances this year. They had that centennial class,
right,
where they have about 20 extra guys going in, and Coryell, and then this is true of Tom Flores too. A lot of people say Tom Flores, the old Raiders coach, should be in the Hall of Fame. He won 2 Super Bowls, but people kind of dismiss him as being in the shadow of Al Davis. But anyways, both Coryell and Flores were in the centennial class consideration, and they did not get selected. So they basically basically have been eliminated already, and
Right.
they'll have to wait till next year to see if they can get their names into the finalist contention again.
Well, it's amazing, Tommy. I've covered 4 Super Bowls, and one of the events I always used to like to cover was the Hall of Fame selections. That, to me, was an event where you have a lot of happy people getting out of there, and it's a proud moment in these people's careers. And I hope Don Coryell does get a chance to experience it one time because, it is one of the most surreal things you can do to be able to finally say you've really reached a plateau. And you're right. I think Tom Flores is an excellent example of guys that were game changers, and then as a result, never got the recognition due that were ahead of their time. I guess what Don Shula says, I would think certainly carries a whole lot of weight without a doubt, and again, I know you're probably leading to this, but you can't forget about the fact that the Miami Dolphins and the San Diego Padres played that epic 41-38 overtime exhausting game that'll go down as one of the greatest playoff games in NFL history.
Yeah, and Faust threw for 434 yards in that game, and younger fans today might shrug their shoulders, but back in those days, if you threw for 300 yards, that was amazing. That's how much the run games dominated the NFL, and so to throw for 400 is just shocking back in those days. And now you have journeyman quarterbacks they'll have a hot day and throw for 400 yards because the rules are so much different. The defensive backs can't chuck the receivers, and they just and the pass blocking, and they have more time. It's just so much easier for wide receivers to get open.
Well, not only that, I think the defining moment in that overtime game was Kellen Winslow being so exhausted he could barely stay on his feet. And I think that's a great example, Tom. You do have journeyman quarterbacks that can go ahead and throw for a lot of yards on any given day. And, that's true. I mean, when you think of a guy like Ryan Fitzpatrick who's making a lot of money and, everybody's numbers are going to be skewed. I think when you talk about the trend in sports, Tom, and I want to utilize this as an example, if I may. The NBA has become a jump shooting league. The NHL resembles the European league, in the Russian style, and the NFL has a lot of those qualities as well. So I think it diminishes a lot of what used to be when you had to really take the E.F. Hutton approach. When E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. Well, everybody's listening, all right, but the problem is for all the wrong reasons, and you're not getting, a lot of these statistics are being what you measure. Dan Marino's 60,000 yards seem to be untouchable. And, he said, I could easily throw for 6,000 yards in this day and era. You know what? I've never liked Dan Marino. I'm never going to be a guy that really cares for a lot of different reasons. But I will say this, though, Tom. I think Dan Marino under today's NFL could throw for 7,000 yards. And I'll tell you why. Great arm strength, excellent quick release, took very few sacks. So, again, that's where the dynamics of this game is gone. I've always respected the Brett Favres because of how many games they played in a row. But, I just want to make sure that we keep in the context that without Coryell bringing on these changes, being ahead of his time, then, yeah, he definitely does make a great case to get in the Hall of Fame. My concern is when he gets in the Hall of Fame, will he be around to enjoy that honor?
Yeah, and then, I asked Jared for some examples of how that passing game was so special. And he was talking about when Coryell got there, Tom Landry was winning like I said, was in the 70 and 71 Super Bowls, and the flex defense that Landry came up with. Because remember, he was a defensive coach first. He was a defensive coordinator with the New York Giants before he came to the Dallas Cowboys as an expansion franchise. And the flex defense, they would have two defensive. This is what Dan Dierdorf explained to me. Two defensive linemen of the four would play at, say, a yard and a half off the ball, and their job was to protect Leroy Jordan, the middle linebacker, so that the lineman couldn't block him. And then Jordan could pretty much flow untouched to the ball. And that's what made the flex defense so special. And Landry got all kinds of credit and publicity for it, for being a genius.